Hey, welcome everyone. Um, Thank you for joining us. This is Third Thursday Talks. My name is Lindsay Hamill, and I'm the Associate Director of Education at UCR Arts. UCR Arts is the California Museum of Photography and the Culver Center of the Arts in downtown Riverside. And today's Third Thursday Talk is a conversation about the exhibition California Stories, Photographs from the Stephen White Collection. Before we begin, we at UCR Arts would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Gabrielino Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. I'd like to introduce our speakers for tonight's program. Dennis Reed is a curator, collector, artist, and writer who is best known for rediscovering an entire community of Japanese American photographers whose works were to a large extent lost in the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans at the onset of World War II. He has curated exhibitions for such institutions as the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Huntington, and the Japanese American National Museum. He has written for Stanford University, Oxford University, and the Getty. He's the retired Dean of Arts at Los Angeles Valley College and the former chair of the Photographic Arts Council at LACMA. In 2019, the Getty acquired his collection of Japanese American photography, and he has donated hundreds of photographs to LACMA, the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, and the California Museum of Photography at UCR. And he's also the curator of California Stories, Photographs from the Stephen White Collection, which is the topic of our conversation today. And Catherine Gudis is Associate Professor of History, Pollitt Endowed Chair for Interdisciplinary Research and Learning, and Director of the Public History Program at the University of California, Riverside. She's worked for over 20 years with art and history museums and historic preservation and on multi-platform place-based projects that focus on Southern California and explore how public space is privatized, landscapes are racialized, and inequalities of access are contested. Kathy's held fellowships from the Getty Research Institute, Harvard University, Haynes Foundation, Huntington Library, and ACLS Mellon Society and Scholars Fellows. She's the author of Byways, Billboards, Automobiles, and the American Landscape, and co-edited books and articles on visual and public culture. And she's currently working on 2 book projects as well. So I'm so pleased to have you both here. I want to encourage our audience to ask questions at any point during the program, and we will answer them in the moment. We can also dive into more questions at the end of the program. We've saved about 15 minutes at the end for that. And otherwise, I will go ahead and hand it over to Dennis.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. Let me screen share. This will take a moment. And here we go. And I'm going to go into this PowerPoint. Okay, I'm going to, and I think things are okay and you can hear me all right. Is that right, Lindsay? Before we go on. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Well, so I'm going to begin with this image, and I'm going to begin with a couple of questions. Do photographs have to be beautiful that are shown in art museums? In fact, for that matter, do they have to be art by the normal standards? Because I think you'll find, those of you who have visited the show or hopefully will, there are a lot of, in fact, I would say the majority of the photographs in this show are not traditionally what you would find in an art museum. Many of them are what we call press photographs. They're news photographs and such. So let's start with this one, because this is actually an exception to the exhibition. So I'm going to show you 4 or 5 different photographs from the exhibition, just to give you a sense of it. And we're going to start out with one that's atypical. This is not typical. I think this is a beautiful photograph myself, and it's certainly an art photograph. It was made as art. The photographer is Leopold Hugo, who started out in La Jolla in 1911. And then moved up eventually to Monterey, where he was kind of well known for photographing trees. And I mean, today he's sort of regarded as basically kind of a tourist photographer, which is what he was. I mean, he made his living selling the trees to tourists. So, but this is not a tree, as you can see. I think this is a pretty powerful photograph. I mean, this churning ocean is violent and threatening, but it's also kind of intimate. I mean, we're so close to it. We feel a part of it. That's a pretty powerful photograph, especially for a guy who's known as kind of, a lightweight photographer of trees. Let me go to the next slide. And I want to compare it just quickly with this drawing. This is actually not a photograph. It's a drawing by V.S. Selmans, done about, a half century later. But I think they're very similar. They both have this. I mean, hers is different. Obviously, it's not a churning sea, and her work tends to be more contemplative, I think, anyway. But it nevertheless, there's a sense of kind of the endlessness of the ocean, and a kind of sense of the eternal and timelessness. So I think that's a pretty powerful photograph that Leopold Hugo did. Now, not all of the photographs, in fact, the majority of them are not like that. Here's a photograph that I think, frankly, is kind of boring. I don't think it's an interesting, powerful image, which is surprising because this was taken by Carlton Watkins. So Watkins was probably the finest landscape photographer of the 19th century. But so why isn't this, more like the really awe-inspiring photographs that he made of Yosemite or the Columbia River, for example? Well, he did this work. This was a work for hire. He was hired to document, in this case, the encampment of the U.S. Coast Survey, it was called. And they were actually encamped here. This is in the San Fernando Valley. And what's really interesting here is this is not an exciting photograph, but the story is exciting. In fact, the story is really consequential. What's going on is this. Under the leadership of George Davidson, who was a geologist and a professor at UC Berkeley, and really quite a prominent character in 19th century California, he was enlisted to map California. Now, not map in the sense, I mean, they already knew where the mountains were and the lakes are and so on, but to map it with precision so that they could determine land boundaries and even the boundary of the state, because that's quite important as the state developed, that you can, if you're buying a piece of land, I mean, this is in 1879, this picture. So back in the 1870s, I mean, if you bought a piece of land, it was from that creek over there to that tree back there, not too precise. So they needed something much more precise. So that's what he did. Let me actually read to you. I have this somewhere. Yeah, here it is. This is from Tyler Green's book called Carlton Watkins, Making the West American. He wrote, "It fell to the survey to overlay the West with a geodetic grid and then to make maps based upon that grid." What they did so was stunning accuracy. I mean, within 1 inch in 90 miles. I mean, didn't have satellites or GPS. Every 90 miles, they were off by 1 inch. That's incredible to me. I mean, I can go measure my living room and I'll be off by an inch. I mean, that they could do that so precisely. And it really did contribute to the development of the state, of California. So, I mean, you can see this is not an impressive, powerful, particularly beautiful photograph, but the story behind it is really important. And that's really what California Stories is really kind of about. Let's go to this photograph. I think, the best of the photographs in the show for me are those ones that have a really fascinating story with them, but are also pretty powerful photographs. And for me, this one fits the bill. This was taken in 1925 in the Antelope Valley, which is at the edge of the Mojave Desert. And you can see it says Mojave Desert double murder. That's actually written. I didn't do that. That's actually on the photograph itself. This was taken by a Los Angeles Times photographer named George Watson. Now, I've never heard of George Watson. This is the only photograph by him I recall ever seeing, but I think he did quite a job. Let me tell you, first of all, the story behind this photograph. I think you've looked at it long enough, and of course, the double murder that's written on it gives you a hint. You can see there's a man there, very well dressed, holding a shotgun, and two dead bodies over there. It almost looks as if he is guarding them, but in fact, he is the murderer. He's the killer. These two men were real estate agents, and he thought they were trying to swindle him out of his land. Well, now, whether he was delusional or whether he had really good evidence, I mean, it may have been true. I don't know. I've actually done a little research, and I wasn't able to answer that question at all. The man, just to give them some individual names, the man in the foreground, the dead man, is Benjamin Friedman, and behind him is G.E. Roach, who was the first of the two shot. So the killer is named Cyrus Kirkpatrick. And so after he killed them, he went in, put on his Sunday best clothes, called the police, brought a chair out from the house and his shotgun, and sat down there and waited for the police to show up, which they did. Now, how George Watson, the photographer, found out about it, I don't know. Maybe he was listening in on the radio or something, but he showed up and he asked if he could, basically have Mr. Kirkpatrick sit back down and take a photograph. And this would never happen today, of course, but the police agreed to it. So he arranged this photograph. Now, I think he did a very good job of it myself. I think it's kind of like Henri Cartier-Bresson. If you think of the decisive moment, most people, when they think of the decisive moment, they're thinking, okay, that moment that you want to take the photograph at the peak of the action, not a second before, not a second after, but just at that decisive moment. But that wasn't all there was to Cartier-Bresson. He also felt, and the reason his photographs are fantastic is you have to also, in that second, arrange the photograph, orchestrate, compose the photograph in such a way that the formal elements of line, shape, value, color, texture are arranged so that it's a unified, harmonious whole that contributes to the effectiveness of the photograph. And I think George Watson did a pretty darn good job of that. I mean, we're drawn to the center of interest, who is Mr. Kirkpatrick. No question about him, because he's dark against a very, for the most part, light background. And then our eyes are drawn more or less by the direction of the shotgun, by the dark area along the basement or along the foundation of this outbuilding, whatever it may be. And then even by the shadow that falls under him that leads us over, in this case, to the lettering. All this takes us over to the dead bodies. And then visually, we can go up in that dark area and come back down in the dark area to the left, back again to Mr. Kirkpatrick. So it's a kind of circular composition, very simple, very, very well orchestrated. And I think that outbuilding actually helps him, organize this. It's like the photographer Louis Baltz, the new topographics photographer Louis Baltz, used to say that the world's overly cluttered. And those of you who are photographers know this. I mean, a painter has a blank canvas, and the challenge for them, and it's a considerable challenge, is they have to think what to add to that blank area. That's not just a challenge, but is kind of the block to overcome, is that blank canvas. For a photographer, it's entirely different. It's almost the other way around. The world is too cluttered. There's too much in it. How do you get rid of all those things that are unnecessary, distracting? And I think he does a really great job of it here in terms of using this wall. I guess it's two walls of this building. In fact, it must occupy 40% of the surface of this photograph. So it really simplifies it and allows us to focus on the main characters pretty darn well. there's also for me, and I'm not saying for a moment that George Watson was thinking of this, but for me, there's an element here almost of the metaphor of this door, a door that you open and go through, or you don't go through, as he, a choices we make. Is a choice he made in killing these men. So I think this is a really compelling and interesting photograph. And adding to its interest even more, it was in an exhibition called Front Page. This was at the California Pacific International Exposition in San Diego in 1936. So what they did, they found every notorious news event, salacious, just violent event that they could find, and then found the 8x10 photographs and put them, these news photographs, they're all news photographs, Front Page, obviously all news photographs, put them in this exhibition. Now they picked about 5 or 6 of those, and they made very big enlargements, about 2 by 3 feet. This photograph that's in the exhibition that we're looking at, that has this lettering on it, is about 2 by 3 feet, and it's in its original frame. They made these enlargement, and these photographs were set at the outside of the entry to this exhibition as an enticement to get people to buy tickets to go in and see the exhibition. And so this is we have 2 of those photographs actually in the exhibition, of which this is one. The thing that strikes me as just so funny about this is, at this fair, they put this exhibition in the fun zone. So apparently this is fun. I don't know if that says what that says about our culture, but there you have it. So let's take a look at a couple others. This is by Otto Hegel. Now, I'm sure none of you have heard of George Watson. As I say, I hadn't heard him before this show either. Otto Hegel may be a new name to most of you too. It shouldn't be, really. He's one of the finest documentary photographers working in the United States in the 1930s. I think he's every bit as good as Dorothea Lange, for example, who's also in the exhibition. Of her classic Migrant Mother is in the exhibition. But I think this is just a powerful photograph. This man is just staring us in the face. And it's binary and symmetrical. I mean, the 2 bars, and those are bars. He's in jail. And his 2 eyes, his 2 ears. I mean, he is not shying away from us. He is looking us straight in the eye. Well, his name is Tom Mooney, or was Tom Mooney. He was a social labor, it was a labor organizer, basically, is what he was. And an agitator, some people would have called him. And he certainly was a thorn in the side of police and the authorities and such. And he was, in 1916, when a bomb went off at a parade in San Francisco, killing 10 people and injuring 40. So this was not inconsequential. He was arrested for that bombing, tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. Well, it became clear almost from the beginning that the authorities were railroading him, were framing him. First of all, he had evidence he was he was in San Francisco, but he was on the other side of town. They ignored it. They didn't care. But it's known now pretty clearly that the district attorney suborned perjury. He paid witnesses to testify against him. Those witnesses later on admitted that their testimony was false. In fact, one of them, it was found later on, he claimed that he saw Tom Mooney put his suitcase down at the site of the bombing, obviously supposedly containing the bomb. But it turned out the witness wasn't even in San Francisco at the time. So committees began to form to free Tom Mooney, and a lot of celebrities. This was all over the world, these committees formed. People like George Bernard Shaw, Upton Sinclair, Carl Sandburg were all on Tom Mooney's side trying to get him free. It wasn't till Woodrow Wilson formed a committee to investigate, and they came back with a finding they could find no evidence to support Tom Mooney's guilt. So with pressure from the president, the governor of California commuted his sentence to life 2 weeks before he's to be hanged. Now, you would think with all of that he would be released from prison. He wasn't. He served 22 years in prison before finally there was a progressive governor in Sacramento who released him. Unfortunately, he'd gotten ill in prison. And as I recall, I think he spent most of his remaining time out of prison in bed. He died, I think it was less than 3 years later at the age of 59. So a very sad story, but a story that would have appealed very much to Otto Hegel and his wife, who also was a photographer, Hansel Meath. She was employed by Life magazine, I think it was, as one of their photographers. He sold photographs to Life and other magazines. He wouldn't work for them. They were both communists, and they didn't want to work for he didn't want to work for a capitalist organization. He actually at one point went up to, I think they bought a chicken ranch in Santa Rosa, which was the source of their income for a while, but just absolutely one of the best documentary photographers of the period. And I think there are four or five photographs by him in the show. I think more than anybody else, or very close to it. Anyway, he's quite a character himself. Very quickly, one last one from me. I think we should do one from the 19th century. Kathy probably is, but yeah, this is one from me. This is a woman named Elizabeth Gilbert. Only she was not known as Elizabeth Gilbert. This is 1858 about, I think, right here. She was known as Lola Montez, the Spanish dancer. She had danced all over the world, and her most famous dance was the spider dance, where she would dance on the stage, and then at one point, eek, she saw a spider, hiked up her dress to reveal her ankle and probably a little bit more, and would dance on till she saw another spider, eek, and would lift her dress. This dance so impressed and what was his name? Ludwig I of Bavaria saw the dance in 1846 and in Munich, when she did the dance in Munich. He was so taken with her that he offered her a castle, which she accepted, along with the title Baroness Rosenthal and Countess of Lansfield. And she became his mistress. Gee, as a young man, if I'd only known, you just give a girl a castle, what do I know? But I was naive. She had quite a life. She's thought to, or at least there are people who believe she also had a relationship with Franz Liszt and Alexander Dumas, the writer. So she ended up in San Francisco in 1853, the height of the gold rush. She married, that was her third marriage. She married a gentleman there. It lasted briefly. Then she divorced and went to Grass Valley, where she tutored Lily Crabtree, I think it was, the actress. At any rate, she then went on a tour in Australia. It failed. So finally, she went back to New York, where I think she was from, where she wrote several successful books. One of them, I want to read you the title. One of the books was The Art of Beauty, or The Secrets of a Lady's Toilet with Hints to Gentlemen on the Art of Fascination. They were basically all about romantic relationships and such. Well, she died at age 39. So young. So this is probably, I would guess, about 3 years before she died. So she packed a lot into those 39 years, I have to say. Well, so I think you've heard enough from me, and time to hear from Kathy.
Dennis, while Kathy is bringing up her screen, I had a question about Otto Hegel, because I noticed, he has several works where he documented the Great Depression and workers.
Yes.
So he wasn't hired by the FSA, though, right?
He was not. To my knowledge, he was not an FSA photographer. He was a documentarian photographer who worked at that same time. And he photographed, he was particularly, I think, of all the photographs in the show, they all relate to labor. One shows a lumberjack, tall, almost heroic, as if he were Paul Bunyan. Now, Steve thinks that that's meant to be ironic, given the political attitudes of Otto Hegel. I think he celebrates labor. So, I mean, he's celebrating a laborer there. And the other three photographs all relate to actually being hired. One shows a group of men trying to get a job in the 30s. One shows two hands going down. It's a bribe for a job. So all of his were fairly, certainly all the ones in the show were fairly focused in terms of subject. I think Kathy's probably ready now.
That makes sense. Thank you. And you're such a good storyteller. We'll let Kathy take over now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dennis. That was fantastic. I wasn't quick enough to show my applause with the little icons, but really interesting. And, I really am interested in the ways in which people have been able to tell stories from essentially somewhat random collections of images, right? So Stephen White has collected for many, many years. I'm very interested in this collection because I love the fact that he highlights commercial photography or photography that we don't quite know what stories to wring from it. So as he has said, some of them have a lot to say, and they say them within the photo itself or the documenting material, or because the people represented are famous, and others are less so. And so I think both are really interesting. So I really became acquainted with the collection, a portion of which is on view currently at the museum. When Stephen contacted me to see if I might contribute a short text to the book that was representing this portion of his collection, and a portion of which is on view at the museum. And so he had mentioned to me that what he was hoping I could do, because I work on histories of the built environment, and I'm especially interested in not just all of California, but especially Southern California, if I could address the rise of the city as an idea. And there were so many photographs, and so many of them related to the ways in which a city is constructed, the way in which a city's image is fixed, both in terms of the celluloid image and the silver or gelatin print image, as well as how it becomes seared in your mind's eye as a result of seeing those images that are circulated. And so I started thinking about the ways in which the rise of the city offers up so much language related to photography and related to the history of the state, right? We're known for the idea of our biggest population booms accompanying prospecting for gold, or speculation on land, on ideas about migrations and immigrations, mobilities, new starts, all kinds of possibilities and inventions. And so those to me are all emblems of the California city rising. But when I stopped to think about it, I also felt like that was about unsettling the people who were here before, or unsettling the land itself on which elements of the built environment rise, and on unsettling expectations and value systems that were based on rootedness and assimilation. And so I ended up writing a short essay that I'm going to talk from and show some images related to, that I titled The Speculative City. And I did so in part because I wanted to get into these ideas of the unsettling, but that I also wanted to think about the multiple ways in which we might use the word speculative, including the ways that we try to tell stories, even when we don't quite know what's going on, and we make some guesses, or we offer some vision that we might be able to put the pieces together in, or we decipher the orchestration of the different iconographies of the image, or where things are placed, as Dennis was showing us or exemplifying before. So I wanted to start just by showing you a picture of the cover of the book. It's very handsome. It's very large. Oh, you can't see it. And by the way, my background image is showing two buildings. It's not an image from the exhibit. It's more sort of highlighting that we are still part of Asian American and Pacific Islander American History Month. And so those are images of the Chinese historic. One of the buildings is the Chinese Historical Society. And I just really love situating myself within Chinatown to show some of the images that I'm going to feature. But this is the cover of the book that features quite a number of photos in the exhibit also. And it features an image that's has become somewhat well known because it actually is quite iconic. It's by George Fisk, and that woman dancing on that outcropping of Glacier Point called Overhanging Rock is Kitty Tatch. She worked as a maid and a waitress at the Sentinel Hotel in Yosemite Valley in the late 1890s and 1900s. And she's wearing those wide skirts and dancing and doing high kicks 3,000 feet above the valley floor. And so the photographer captures her dancing with her friend, and then these images become made into postcards, autographed by her, and sold for a really long time at Yosemite National Park. So when I think of the idea of the speculative, I'm also thinking about the ways in which we can kind of reproduce an image in order to promote the references that are within it, and then let it also have another life of its own. But I really want to start with ways in which we can think about photography and the camera in the 19th and early 20th centuries as among those tools of speculation and prospecting. Now, when we think about speculation, we think about things like, and I think about it very much around real estate, especially today, given the hot real estate market. But it's something is speculative when we aren't exactly sure of it. We don't know its sure value. That can't be supported necessarily, like with real estate, when the market grows based on a belief in future changes, right? So to speculate is often to wonder and to conjecture, but not necessarily with firm evidence. And that's sort of why it also goes well with the idea of prospecting that's part of the history, to look out for and to search. So in both of those kinds of examples, we're trying to see the future while we're still in the here and now. And in both of those kinds of examples of the word speculate, we're trying to extract value based on uncertainty and unsettlement. And so the camera, as among those tools of speculation used to sell and to see places, also included seeing and promoting and circulating images of people. And so it fits with what photo historians have talked about as a speculative gaze, right? Where oftentimes the subject is objectified or the view is colonized, even as it serves as an empirical form of knowledge. So with the photo that I'm showing right here, I'm trying to highlight what I see as a somewhat remarkable image in many ways. And hold on one second, because I do have the caption in here, if I can make it come up. There we go. This is a photograph that is from approximately 1900, and it features 4 young African-American people who are dressed in all of the stylish garb of the moment. The card indicates it's a cabinet card, so it would have been a studio shot. This is a fake background. And what it's sort of suggesting to us is a notion of middle or upper class urbanity. Now, Burton Hodgson, whose Sacramento studio did this photograph, was following a tradition that his father had established. His father, John, had operated a photo gallery in Sacramento from the early 1880s, and then later added a gallery in San Francisco. And I love this image because it's offering a scene of leisure and privilege, right? So it's a visual taxonomy of upward mobility, what W.E.B. Du Bois might have deemed the talented 10th, proving through epistemological means that African Americans were not, as pseudoscientists were trying to say they were in this moment, which was an inferior race. And so this photograph becomes part of a larger archive or historical archive that ensures several things. On the one hand, it ensures that what's left behind are not only racialized visual images or records of violence or criminalization or otherness. Rather, they serve as a way to empower and to embody actual African Americans of the day who, in fact, W.E.B. Du Bois was documenting himself as a sociologist and as a leading, what we'll call in later years, a civil rights leader, what he's seeking to do, which is to employ visual evidence, in all different forms of visual evidence that he then would present in 1900 at the Paris Exposition. So I love this image from 1900 that is part of a moment when there is so much more movement building around showing the advancement of African Americans to counter the racist assumptions and the white supremacy that has been building also through taxonomies that show the opposite in terms of our pseudoscientific notions and into eugenics. He soon after W.B. Du Bois, who I have no evidence is connected to this image, but yet I'm still sort of making some leaps between, later then writes The Souls of Black Folks and identifies that the major issues of of America is the color line, right? And so I love this image as a way of speculating on futures, right? And also offering visual evidence. I similarly appreciate this image, which was by a photographer named William Shue, who had a studio not far from Arnold Gente's, who's very well known for his photographs of San Francisco's Chinatown. Now, William Shue was known to be an activist in his day in the 1880s when this was taken. He himself had used portraits that were once the exclusive domain of the wealthy as a much more accessible and expressive photographic tool to assert one's social standing. But what I'm interested in this image, which again, I have very little information about except what's in the caption, are the ways in which the people in this self-portrait, William Shue is in the center, are posed as well as their dress. Similar to the previous image, they're dressed as potentially merchants of an aspiring or an emerging rising class. And included in the image, you'll notice, are two children. Well, the image is likely from somewhere around 1882, and that's a notable date because in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act had been passed into law by President Chester Arthur, which eliminated Chinese citizenship or ability to naturalize, as well as immigration. Now, the point of that act, needless to say, was to prohibit Chinese immigrants who were increasingly seen as quote unquote unassimilable from coming to the United States, and especially to keep them from working as laborers. So these little clues are offering where I want to go with this image, obviously, which is to say that the image itself is offering an opportunity to almost sell these as Chinese merchantmen, but also to sell the idea that as merchants were establishing themselves in the United States, they were also going to be growing families, right? So I feel like the children who are included in this image are a way of showing that there would be a rootedness of this form of immigration. Now, the other thing that I find really fascinating with this image, which has to do perhaps in some ways with the notions of speculation related to photographs, is the idea that the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act were what marks the first real immigration restrictions and exclusions in the United States. Photography as a tool is also emerging at the same moment. And it's within the Chinese Immigration Exclusion Act that we begin to see photography used as a tool of surveillance. It's used very specifically to surveil those people who are coming in and are being tested by the immigration officers on whether they belong or have the right to enter the United States. And so this image, I'm sorry that I didn't locate an image that was I wanted to find a Southern California image that was a little earlier, but this is an image of an immigrant who came into, I believe, Boston. And you can see that included in the file is not only the information that they gather through his interview, but also a photograph. So photographs are used extensively. We now have the possibility to go into the National Archives records, which have been digitized. And there's a crowdsourcing tool to try and learn more information and transcribe the names on the paperwork. Now, each of these pieces of paper in the immigration file tells an extended story of people who are seeking not only to remain in the country, but to establish both their lineage and their status as a merchant class, because we continued to exclude laborers. And so I'm really taken with this idea of the different ways that we might, and later as we're able to do more research on these individual images and try and identify names associated with some of the portraits, to be able to cross-reference them with these kinds of immigration records. So this is yet another way we might think about the speculative city as also being a city that's about surveillance. And I'm jumping around because I wanted to go from this idea of identifying and circulating the images of yourself, right? And even thinking about it in terms of newcomers to a region, like these are newcomers. There are other images that we have that are on view in the exhibit that also show a gold rush family, for instance. And I like to think about the ways in which the gold rush family, like other working people, might be presenting themselves not only to send back home in other parts of the country or the world, but also I like to think of it as an emblem that helps us leap from the visual images to the land by thinking about the ways in which you prove up when you get a homestead tract in the West. You get a parcel of land and you can hold on to it if you do something to cultivate that land, right? And that idea of cultivating yourself and the land, proving up through the image you circulate of yourself from a studio portrait as a marker of a middle-class status, is like the way you might develop the land to prove up, to give it value, all right? And we can think about that for industrial photography as well. So that idea of the speculative city runs in different ways, that the tool of photography is used very specifically to help build infrastructure, to pump wealth out of the land itself. And this is an image that's labeled on the bottom, and it's unknown. We don't know who the photographer was, but presumably they were hired to be able to represent the landscape of the oil industry. It's an oil field east from First Street around 1910. Interestingly, the houses that are there and the shape of the landscape is strikingly reminiscent of the area around Echo Park in downtown, close to downtown Los Angeles, where over the last several years, people who live in bungalows lining those streets have been horrified to discover that, in fact, when these derricks were removed, all of the ways in which they were plunging this drill into the ground to extract the oil, everything that was subterranean remained. Those wells were simply capped off. And at this late stage, historically, they're not all sealed as they should be. They were never remediated, and they've had to deal with that. So when we look at this image, we get the visual evidence of what's above ground, knowing that what's beneath ground is still an unsettling fact, right, of where we might live and be prone to what are now dangerous toxins that are springing from this. And we can think even more clearly about the ways in which speculation works with these extractive industries when we think not only of, say, the Carlton Watkins images of surveying or surveilling the landscape that Dennis showed, that idea of surveyors both marking off a grid of the city in order to name it, in order to continue white settlement that displaces indigenous people who were here before, and to create photographs that also instantiate our settlement and displacement, to build the physical evidence of our claiming that land. Here we might think of oil claims or land claims, or how, you know, we gain value. And I really love this image in part because when I saw that it was the Aerograph company, I started sort of digging around, and I was really interested in the ideas of governmental and geological survey teams, or like the Huddleston brothers, whose name is hidden somewhere. Oh, I found their name through the Aerograph company. So the Huddleston brothers, who were behind this image, were miners. And so they had knowledge of soil, and they also had mastery of the panorama, because they had been trying to surveil different landscapes to figure out for oil companies what might lie there, right? And so in the 1920s, the youngest brother Freeman Huddleston devised a pilotless dirigible, or an air balloon, basically, to hold his camera high in the sky. And I love this because I see it as a predecessor to drones today. So everything new is, everything old is new again. And they created the Airgraph Company. So he gains this bird's eye view of the land and the landscape, as he is also participating in its transformation from dirt to real estate, right? And so in 1924, his Airgraph captures this, and I have to say, in the exhibit, this image looks really fantastic. It captures this gush of oil spewing high from Union Oil Company's derricks and pumps in Long Beach. And in a way, I like to think about the Long Beach setting too, right? It's joining these discoveries by gold prospector Edward Doheny at the Los Angeles City oil fields downtown, where that previous image would have been from, which makes LA home to the largest number of urban oil fields in the United States. And so these images are of LA's, this one and the other one, of Los Angeles's engines of development, powered by these oil deposits far beneath the surface. And so these show us the ways that what we can no longer see with the naked eye does have remnants, right? And that we can often see those layers of time in the remnants, whether those remnants are photographs or the built environment itself. And sometimes we can also read that past quite literally in the signs that are captured in photographs, such as that which you see here with the Pekin Curio Shop in Old Chinatown on Los Angeles Street near Alameda Avenue in downtown LA. So this building is really a fantastic way to think about those layers of time that the sign helps give us some structure to, because in fact, the building itself was constructed in 1840 for the Lugo family, those famous, families that had lots of land ownings. And the adobe building in the photo was the only two-story structure in El Pueblo at LA's founding. By the 1880s, only a decade after the same streets had witnessed 18 Chinese boys and men murdered in the violent race riot and massacre of the Chinatown of the Chinese Massacre of 1871, the Lugo adobe housed Japanese and Chinese art as part of what was promoted as an exotic shopping district. Its appeal was magnified through other events that went by here, like other images that are in the exhibit. There are several of the Chinese dragon operated by a lot of men that was part of those nostalgic in the present day of the moment whitewashing of a multicultural past, but allowing a celebration of it through festivals, etc. But the reason I also like this image is because it bears the signs of the ways in which Chinese Americans lived before they decided to construct a new Chinatown, several new Chinatowns that would take on a different, quote unquote, orientalized appearance to sell the idea in Anglo minds, particularly of an orientalized view of Chinatown. So that idea of selling becomes another thing. I also really appreciate this image because this site of the Lugo Adobe became a state historic landmark. And it did retain the Chinese merchants of this particular shop, as well as the Hop Sing Benevolent Society, the United Christian Church Chinese Mission. It hosted all of these different residents, including the Hai Hong grocery and merchandise over the decades. So flourishing even after the rest of old Chinatown in the 1930s was bulldozed, and Union Station rose in its place by 1939, just a year before the opening of the Arroyo Seco freeway. We can think of that as a marker, that first freeway in the United States. Well, later freeway expansions then, oops, I'm out of time, ultimately took out these last storefronts of old Chinatown, including this Lugo adobe, paved over despite vociferous community opposition to make way for the ramps to the Hollywood freeway in 1949 and somewhere between 49 and 51. But we can think about another image that both Dennis and I were very interested in talking about too, that sort of shows a different set of signs that are marked by what are called spectaculars. Spectacular signs are those illuminated electrical signs, often in neon, like this one, like Walter Fong, which is entitled China. I thought it was entitled Chinatown at Night, but I see now that it's untitled. And it has a typeface that you see there, which you recognize from all sorts of restaurant, menu covers and what my graphic designer friends call chop suey typeface to call out, again, the ways in which commerce is interspersed with the design style that fabricates an Orientalized identity to dramatize an ethnic enclave like this one, or like those that might have been similarly shown in LA's Chinatown, kind of like the noir films that would come later in the 40s and 50s. So I want to stop and start with this image so that Dennis can join in this conversation, because this, I think, is for him, like it is for me, a really favorite image in the exhibition, or at least one of them. One of many. So I wanted to kind of, bring him in to use this as a conversation starter.
All right. Well, you're right. Exactly. I think if I could take any image from the show Home, this is the one I would take. I think it's just a fantastic image. And it appeared on the cover of the gentleman, Wallace. Yeah, there it is right there. Wallace Fong was, he worked for this really kind of short-lived magazine. It started out as I think it was a daily, then it went a weekly, and then to a monthly between 1935 and 1940. And he did the photographs for them. So as you can see, it appeared on the cover. I think it's April 37, if I remember right. But Chinatown in San Francisco in particular is just so interesting because, it obviously was the Chinese enclave, the place where Chinese Americans lived and worked and so on. And then a funny thing happens after that 1882, anti-Chinese bill is passed. For some, it's really funny. The white community starts to no longer see the Chinese community as quite as much of a threat. And Chinatown starts to become nostalgic a bit for them. And then, of course, it's wiped out in the 1906 earthquake, virtually destroyed. And so as it's being rebuilt, there's great fondness among the entire community in San Francisco for Chinatown. And the residents of Chinatown realize perfectly well that there's a great revenue resource here by attracting tourists. So they just Disneyland it up a little bit. Sometimes it's called theme park it. So they used elements from Chinese temples and so on added to the architecture, and of course the signage. And I've always the neon sign just always really cracks me up because it reminds me of Vegas and other places it just really wants to sell this as an exotic location, which, and then of course in the 30s. You get institutions, nightclubs start to come in, like the Forbidden City, and its sort of otherness and exotic nature is emphasized. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and I think he captures some of that. And then as you pointed out, it also has that it feels like a shot from a film noir, which it precedes slightly. But yeah, I think it's quite a remarkable photograph.
Yeah, I think that the reason why I keep reflecting on the noirish image of it is the way that I think it's Eric Avila and maybe also Ed Dimmenberg, scholars who write about that era. And we can think about noir as being the fiction writers, like, Chandler, for instance, whose work then they join Hollywood as screenwriters, but then their films get made. But the ways in which oftentimes the films become almost a last hurrah for the sense of a downtown. And yet they're laced with a feeling of, I think it's called noir in part because it's laced with that feeling of darkness that is also about fear and creating an otherness that puts people of color in the position of those who are both othered, but also frightening to those who are, say, behind the wheel of a car in the noir image. You can almost picture the 1937 automobile going down this street. So it's a moment of urban identity that is perhaps not long for everyone's imagination because it begins to be separated by sense of sprawl, less so in San Francisco, but certainly in other parts of the country, including Los
I've always
Angeles.
been it's remarkably, I mean, I've been to Chinatown many times, of course, written about it and so on. And I've never seen it that empty.
Yes, right.
Apparently it had just rained and there was a lot of fog. So he kind of solved that problem I talked about earlier of an overly cluttered world of just, and I think that adds to the noir quality as well. The emptiness.
And the light, the way that the light is in the middle of the street, in the back of towards the mid half of the top portion of the image is really interesting because, the lights have created that image of movement so it implies a car, even though we're not stuck with having to see the cars moving. Even the cars in it are kind of muted, on the left, when the parked cars. Yeah, it's really wonderful also because it gives us a feel for the ways that signage has been an incredible way in which we can not only identify places, but also have a feeling for them. It does that for me, at least. There's something about them.
And I look at this photograph, I think back to all the others because so many people have photographed Chinatown. I mean, of course, countless people as tourists have come through photographing it as if it were a foreign land. But I'm talking about people who live and work in the area in Chinatown itself, but others like who from the outside but became familiar with it, like Ginther is a good example. And you look at his photographs and are often criticized because he would in the same way that Edward Sheriff Curtis would when he photographed Native Americans. He would completely fictionalize them. He would carry around a trunk that he would take out headdresses from one tribe and put them on a Native American from a different tribe to dress them up the way he thought a Native American should look. So we don't get the truth with Curtis, but we do get some vision of the noble savage that he was after. Well, so with Chinatown and with Ginther, what you got was not just Chinatown. It was a Chinatown seen through a certain European eye, and that got rid of anything that didn't look quite exotic enough to him. And then it gets interesting to me because really, this is one of the few photographers, a professional photographer, not a tourist, who is somebody who lived and worked in Chinatown, who's photographing Chinatown, which the tradition carries on later. There's no examples in the show, but in the work of Charles Wang and Benjamin Chin, who were both born in Chinatown and then went on to make art photographs of the location of the section of the city in which they were born. So so many different, and of course they don't romanticize it in the same way, and neither, but in a way he has. So there's kind of, I don't know, this what Anthony Lee, who there's an interesting book he did called Picturing Chinatown, what he calls the in-betweenness of cultures. And Chinatown is such a interesting mix of those in-betweenness of cultures.
I think there's like a whole other presentation on the ways we could address these images and really, in a way, think about too how when we think of the long haul of imagery and ways in which Ginther, for instance, was sort of sealing off Chinatown as an entity out there, over there, right? That conform to his particular notion of what that would look like, and the ways in which we might, problematize that with a whole range of, I'm thinking of images that Visual Communications in LA has of people in Chinatown in contemporary eras and film that just show such a robustness that sort of get back around to
in the tradition of photography in Chinatown goes far further back than most people think. The earliest photographer I know of, this is a portrait photographer, but his name was K. Chow, and he started in 1854. That's so, I mean, otherwise people, Chinese Americans would have to go to if they wanted their portrait taken, go to a Caucasian run studio, and which they were actually welcomed, I think, because they wanted the money,
Right.
so they would,
Right.
but as early as 1854, they had their own studio within Chinatown doing portraits. So this photograph I see is a part of a surprisingly long tradition.
I don't know if there are questions out there or if we're out of time.
I think
We are about out of time, but thank you so much to both of you. This has been so nice to take a deep dive or a little bit of a dive into just a few of the works in this exhibition. This is a large exhibition of photography, and so we just encourage everyone to come see it, where it's on view at the California Museum of Photography until July 31st. So you have plenty of time. And thank you again so much to both of you for this discussion. It's been so interesting.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, wonderful. All right, have a good evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.